Everyone laughed when she told the waiter to play a song, but when his fingers touched the keys, the whole room fell into this stunned, guilty silence. You could feel it ripple through the air, like somebody had thrown a sheet over the noise, just snuffed it out in one breath. The ballroom at the Franklin Cultural Center in Columbus, Georgia, wasn't the sort of place where people expected surprises. It was golden, bright, crowded with folks wearing their names on little silver pins, not so anyone would remember, but so they'd never let each other forget. Harold Benton worked that room like he'd worked 100 others, weaving through the tables with a tray of half-empty champagne flutes, quiet, careful, almost invisible, and honestly, he didn't mind. At 67, he learned most people only looked at you when they wanted something or when they wanted to remind you how small they thought you were. Either way, Harold had let it all slide for years. But that night, something shifted, something in the air, or maybe in him. Camilla Wexler, perched right in the middle of the crowd like a rare bird, sparkled as she glanced at Harold just as he reached for a glass near her elbow. She gave him a smile that wasn't really a smile, more like the performance of one, then tilted her head toward the baby grand piano tucked in the corner by the bar. "You know," she said loud enough for half the room to hear, "I bet you know how to play. Why don't you give us a little something, set the mood?" There were a few polite chuckles, people laughing mostly because they thought they should, not because they got the joke. Camilla sipped her wine, eyes glinting, certain she'd landed a clever one. Harold didn't flinch, just met her eyes, steady as a stone. You could hear the shift as the cutlery quieted, people turning in their chairs, waiting for a punchline. Without a word, he set his tray down, walked over to the piano, pulled out the bench, dusted it off, and sat. For a moment, he just held his hands above the keys, like he was reaching back to touch something lost. Then he began. The first notes were so soft you could barely hear them over the air conditioning, but each one landed like a secret being confessed. It wasn't party jazz, it was Clair de Lune, slow, aching, fragile, every note fighting for its place in the world. Folks froze mid-sentence. Even Camilla sat up straighter, her glass hanging in the air. Harold's hands floated, graceful, not searching, not hesitating, wasn't looking down, didn't need to. The music came from somewhere much older than the room, deeper than memory. There was no sheet music, no showmanship, just a man, a piano, and a truth so raw it didn't need explaining. By the time he reached the heart of the piece, nobody was laughing, nobody spoke. Even the servers froze in place, the photographer lowered his camera, and for one beautiful minute, it was like every person in that place saw Harold Benton for the first time. But no one there had a clue who he really was. Long before the tray and tux, before the ballroom, Harold was a boy in Baltimore, falling asleep with his fingers curled around piano keys, a mother humming old gospel as she folded laundry, a father who believed in hard work before dreams, but a mother who pressed his fingers and whispered, "Don't let them tell you different, baby." By 11, he could play anything by ear. By 13, he was writing his own songs. A middle school teacher dragged in a recording engineer, got him in a Juilliard's pre-college program. Harold had never seen New York, but the day he got that letter, his mother cried and hugged him so hard he thought he'd burst. Juilliard changed him, not the place, but the certainty in the other students, the way they took up space without apology. Harold was talented, but they moved like they belonged. Still, he outworked everyone, hands blistered, fingers numb, practicing until he bled. At 23, he played Carnegie Hall, wore a suit his cousin mailed him that was 2 sizes too big, but he played like he'd waited his whole life for that moment. And when it was over, the applause was a blur, only remembered the silence after the last note. But life isn't fair, and dreams don't always pay the bills. When his sister Rosalie collapsed at her diner job, leukemia, the doctor said, and a 5-year-old son left behind, Harold went home, sold his piano, took a catering job, told himself it was just for a while. 1 week turned into a year, then decades. He raised Marcus, paid rent, put the boy through college. He taught lessons on the side, but never went back to New York. He didn't ask for another spotlight. But late at night, sometimes he'd tap out melodies on the kitchen counter, chasing pieces of music he'd once known. The melody faded, but the way it made him feel never did. 33 years with the same catering company, people called him Sir when sober and Hey, you, when they'd had too much. He smiled at both, watched the world change from behind white gloves, saw socialites, developers, old money, new money, scandals, affairs she never judged, just remembered his place. Smooth, silent, reliable. Sometimes, when setting up, he'd sit at the event piano, play just enough to hear the sound in the empty room, just enough to feel a bit of that old fire stir. No one ever noticed, and if they did, they didn't care. That night at the Franklin, when Camilla laughed and pointed him toward the piano, Harold wasn't angry he was awake. He walked to that piano not to prove anything, not for applause, just because someone had given him a crack in the wall he'd been living behind. He played not for the room, but for the part of himself he'd buried. But as the last note floated away, the room broke into applause, hesitant at first, then reverent, almost guilty. Camilla's face changed. She didn't clap at first, couldn't. She realized, for once, the joke wasn't hers. People started Googling, whispering, did you know he could play like that? Wasn't that Debussy? A photographer caught the whole thing. A local journalist typed, "Waiter stuns gala crowd." The videos hit social media before Harold even got home. Instagram, TikTok, shaky phone footage within an hour. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to know who he was. But Harold, riding the bus home, folding his tux in a locker room, had no idea. His phone didn't do apps. He slept easy, same as always. But by noon the next day, news sites had picked up the story. Juilliard pianist turned waiter, local legend, a life of talent hidden in plain sight. Folks dug up old recital photos, awards, a black and white headshot from the Lincoln Center. For every bit of praise, Harold remembered all the times he'd been overlooked, told, maybe you should write for others, not perform, or that was beautiful, unexpected. The world didn't expect much from men like Harold Benton. But the piano didn't care. When he played, he reclaimed something nobody could take. Back at work, the mood had changed. The photographer wanted an interview. The gala director said Camilla Wexler wanted to apologize. Camilla showed up in a plain sweater, tired, nervous. She said, "I was wrong. I thought I was being playful, but it was dismissive. I didn't know your story, but that's no excuse." Harold met her gaze and said, "You didn't have to know my history. You just had to treat me like a person." She swallowed, nodded, and said thank you for making her see. For once, the apology wasn't for show. Later, when the event was done, a younger server asked if he'd ever play again for real. Harold shrugged. "I never stopped. Just didn't have an audience for a while." But the story kept spreading. Community centers called. Music teachers. People sent invitations, wanted to book him just to hear one more song. Even Juilliard's alumni office reached out. Marcus, proud as could be, read the offers aloud. "Maybe it's time," he said. Harold didn't say yes or no, just kept living, washing his dishes, but something had changed. 3 days after the gala, Camilla showed up at his door, not for attention, not with cameras, just herself. "I keep thinking about what you showed us," she said. "I like to support something that matters, quiet things, the kind that don't get noticed." Harold led her to his small, upright piano, rebuilt from scraps over the years. "If you want to know who I am, sit and listen." He played not a showpiece, just a quiet, personal melody, uneven but honest. Camilla left with wet eyes and a promise. If he ever played again, she'd be there, not as a donor, just as someone who wanted to listen. 2 weeks later, the local community center filled with folding chairs, curious neighbors, some of Harold's co-workers, and even Camilla in the third row. No makeup, just listening. Harold played Beethoven, then something of his own, a piece nobody knew, but everyone felt. There was no thunderous ovation, just the kind of quiet that fills a room when something real happens. Afterward, a little girl asked, "Do you know any songs with dragons?" Harold smiled. "Not yet, but maybe I'll write one." A music teacher asked if he'd visit the school. Harold thought, maybe some things don't end, they just wait. As the last notes faded and folks filed out, Harold lingered by the piano, pressing the keys, feeling the old magic in his bones. The world hadn't made him famous, but it had made him seen, and that's all he ever needed. Sometimes the greatest recognition isn't noise or headlines, it's being heard, really heard, after a lifetime of being invisible. And if this story made you pause, share your thoughts below. What does recognition mean to you? Who in your life might be waiting to be truly seen?